All right, we are almost done with Numbers. I think we'll finish it on Monday or Tuesday. We're powering through this book. It's gotten more exciting, right? Yes. Okay. So I know someone texted me last night and they were like, I have died the death of Leviticus. I was like, what do you mean? And they're like, I still haven't made it through Leviticus. So for some of you who are still trying to finish Leviticus, master the reset, hop into today's reading. Don't die the Leviticus death. You will not finish it. So it's easier to read in a community and with other people doing the same pace as you. So do this together. There will always be time next year to read Leviticus in the Bible reading plan. I just want to know, show a thumbs. How did reading go this last week? Thumbs up, like did all the reading. Thumbs down. This week was just pretty bad. And then somewhere in the middle. Okay, so somewhere in the middle. Great. So we do have a lot that we can talk about. There is a lot that I want to talk about, but unfortunately, there's only a few things that we will talk about. So what we're going to do today is we're going to focus on the rebellion narratives. So Numbers, if you remember, from chapter 1 through chapter 10, they're at Sinai. They're still in the wilderness of Sinai, and they're just kind of they're getting ready to set out on their journey towards the promised land. So Numbers starts off with the census where they list all of the men who are 20 years or older, so people who can fight in war. So they list all those people, and then they talk about the Levites who aren't numbered for war because they're for the service of the tabernacle. You get the description of how the people are to arrange their camp with the tabernacle at the center and 3 tribes on either side. So God is literally and theologically the center of the Israelite life. And then you get directions for how they're supposed to camp, hike and walk. Which tribe's supposed to be in the front, which tribe's supposed to be in the back. And that's basically covering chapters 1 through 10. And then when we get to chapter 10, halfway through, they start setting off on their journey. And there's a transition of them actually walking. And then they're in the wilderness of Paran for a while. And there's all these stories happening. And it seems like it goes back and forth between a story and then some laws, a story and then some laws. And then you get another little journey from Paran to Moab. And then when we get to chapter 22, from there on out, they are in Moab. They're in the land of Moab right before they're going into the promised land. So there's this geographical markers to the book where we can think of they're in the wilderness of Sinai, then they're in the wilderness of Paran, then they're in the wilderness of Moab. And those are kind of like the big road mark movements of the book. But then within the book, there are also these key sections, and one of them is in the middle from chapter 10 arguably to chapter 21 or to 25. There's these rebellion narratives where Israel just keeps rejecting God, rejecting Moses, and rejecting Aaron. So if you remember last week, I talked about how the book of Numbers is standing as a testimony against the generation who came out of Israel. Here's why the generation out of Egypt. Here's why the Exodus generation doesn't enter the promised land. So we're going to look at some of those stories and kind of see big picture stuff, and then hopefully have time for your guys' questions, and we'll just go where you guys take us. So let me pray for us, and then we'll dive in. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for giving breath to our lungs and sight to our eyes and ability to our bodies to be able to be here this morning. God, we ask that you would give us eyes to see and ears to hear what is in your word, that you would show us who you are more clearly, and that we would come to know Christ more fully. God, you're a good God, and we, like the Israelites, are often people who complain and grumble, but God is not dependent on our faithfulness, but the faithfulness of Christ in our place. So we're really thankful for that. But this stands as a witness for us to learn from. God, we love you, and we need you to pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So before we dive in, I mentioned this in an email, but 1 Corinthians chapter 10, this is a huge warning chapter, but it's all referencing stories from the book of Numbers that Paul is using. So we'll just read it. I won't really explain too much of it. Hopefully some of the things set off light bulbs, and then we'll go back to some of these stories. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test. In the wilderness, it's about them testing God, and Paul says we should not test Christ, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction. So why was Numbers written? For our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. We who have these writings, this is the end of the age, has come upon us. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure. So that is Paul's instruction for the church, all from a reflection of the book of Numbers primarily. So now we're just going to dive in to Numbers. So I don't know if you guys have ever seen the meme, but it's Charlie Day from Sunny in Philadelphia, and he's like smoking a cigarette, and he's got all these like lines on the graph. Let me find it for people who don't know. It's really funny. Well, I don't have a ton of time, right? Just kidding. This picture, this is what I felt like last night trying to explain Numbers to Chelsea, because I was trying to figure everything out of how many rebellion stories are there actually and what does it all center on. And I was trying to explain it, and she was looking at me like I was this guy. All right, here are some of my charts that I've taken from people and ones that I've made. So here's what we were just talking about. Chapters 1 through 10 is the wilderness of Sinai. Then you have a chapter and a half where they're traveling to Paran. Then chapters 13 through 19, they're in the wilderness of Paran. And first you have that rebellion narrative where they are rebelling against the promised land and the Exodus. They're like, we wish we were back in Egypt. Oh, that we had died in Egypt. We're going to appoint a leader to take us back. That's in 14 after the spies go into the land. Then you have a few laws. Then in 16 and 17, you have a rebellion narrative where the Korites, Korah and 200 plus people, they all go against Moses and Aaron, but really they're going against Aaron as being the high priest. And then you have a few more laws. Then you have 2 chapters where they're traveling from Paran to Moab. And then the rest of the book, they're in the wilderness of Moab. You have those Balaam narratives where Balaam is up on the mountain and he's quote unquote cursing with blessings. And then you have chapters 26 through 36, which is a new census of the new generation. And then you have new laws and then the ordering of the land. So that's really big picture stuff. This is from a scholar who goes from Numbers 10 to Numbers 21. So those wilderness journeys after they're in Sinai and before they're in Moab. And he just sees this as being a chiasm. We're not going to walk through this, but people have given a lot of thought and attention to these things. That's David A. Dorsey. This is from Thomas Romer, and he sees there being 7 rebellion narratives in the book of Numbers. And they all start with something like complaining or coming against or terms like rebelling. So there's 7 of them. And the first one is just 3 verses. And you don't really get details about what they're complaining about. It just says that they're complaining about their misfortunes or their like their bad circumstances. And then the fire of the Lord breaks out and consumes some people. Then in that same chapter, you have them complaining about food. They're like, oh, that we had the meat that we used to have in Egypt and the leeks and all the delicious vegetables, how we want meat so much. So God's judgment is that he actually gives the people what they're longing for, and quail come on the land. And as they're biting the quail, as it's in their teeth, that's when they are dropping dead and a plague is coming upon them. Then in chapter 12, you have you have Aaron and Miriam coming and rebelling against, complaining about Moses. They're like, well, has God really just spoken to you? Has he not also spoken to many people? And then God steps in and defends Moses against Aaron and Miriam. So it all brings us to a head on one of the longest sections, chapter 13 and 14, which is the spies going into the promised land, coming back. 10 of them give a bad report, but 2 of them say, we got this. God's going to give this land into our hands. And then chapter 14 is about the people saying, we don't even want to go into the land. It sounds like it's going to be too hard. There's giants in there. We don't want to die. It would have been better to die in Egypt. We're going to appoint a leader to take us back. So the people rebel against the Exodus. And it seems like it very logical that this is the center story, because the promise that comes from God, the promise of judgment, is that because the spies were in the land for 40 days, now for 40 years, you are going to wander in the wilderness, and this generation will not enter. So the entire generation is cut off from the promised land, and it's the next generation that gets to go in. So then everything from there is just pulling you out of that picture. So the next one is a complaint against Aaron. Korah, the rebellion of Korah, they're complaining about Aaron. So here you have a rebellion against the appointed leader of God, a rebellion against the appointed leader of God. And both of those, it's Levites against Levites. So Aaron and Miriam, they're Levites, and they're complaining about Moses, who's a Levite. And then you have this story where the Korahites, who are Levites, are complaining against Aaron. So it's a Levite competition. Then you have the next one, which is they're like, we have no water. So Moses strikes the rock twice. And in that one, it's a complaint about water. It's a complaint about food. So you have food and water paralleling each other. And both of those are repeat stories from the book of Exodus. They're replaying a story that has already taken place for the Israelites. So it's almost like it's double ironic that they do not listen to God and don't trust that God can actually provide for them. And then the last one would be when the people complain against God and Moses, and the fiery serpents come in. And in that judgment, the judgment comes by them being bitten by fiery snakes, when the first judgment was that they're consumed by fire. So consumed by fire, consumed by fiery serpents. So these are just paralleling each other in that way. There could also be another. So there are many structures that are possibilities. So one thing that I was thinking about is the Phineas narrative after the Israelites are linking themselves to Baal. So don't worry about taking this down in notes. I could also send all this in emails. But I was looking at it because I was wondering about that Numbers narrative, because right after Numbers 25, you have 26, which is the new census. It's as if the rebellions are completed. There's just a few key words that are missing in that narrative from these other ones. But if that were included, then it would all center on the rebellion against Aaron, the high priest. So there are many ways to look at this. Look, I have another one. So yeah, I have another one. I have another one. Just kidding. So I do think this one's also feasible. And I'm just like, this is what I do to try and understand the text. Is I'm just writing things down, and I'm trying to see correlations between these stories. And once I get to a point where I'm like, well, these don't correlate at all, then I've gone too far, and I can begin to backtrack. But with this one, if there really were 10 rebellion narratives centering on chapter 15, which has the Sabbath breaker in it, which is kind of a weird, obscure story. Then you have Numbers 14 and Numbers 16, where the spies are against Caleb and Joshua. And then you have Korah, which is against Aaron and Moses. In the beginning of Numbers 14, the people of Israel are longing for the death. Oh, that we had died in Egypt. But in Numbers 16, they start accusing Moses. You are killing us. So there's these accusations of death, same word showing up. And then Numbers 12, when Aaron and Miriam are accusing Moses of being a bad leader before God, God responds that Moses is faithful. Moses is faithful in my household. But then that corresponds to Numbers 20, when Moses strikes the rock twice. And in that text, God says that Moses was unfaithful. So you have the story of Moses' faithfulness, and then you have a story of Moses' unfaithfulness. Numbers 21 and Numbers 14, or Numbers 11, the complaint of both of those is, give us food. Oh, that we had more food. Give us food. We hate this bread. The only thing then that becomes weird is I don't really know how these first ones and the last one correspond. So that's why I'm like, I don't actually know if this is a pattern. So all that to say, we're just going to look at some of these stories and see what's going on in them. I don't know if that was too much or if that overwhelmed you. If it did, it's okay. We're going to leave it behind and we're going to forget about it. Okay. Let's look at... Do you get it now? You guys all feel like I'm this. Let's look together at... let's just go to chapter 11 and start working through some of these. Okay. The people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. Then people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. So this kind of sets the pattern for all these rebellion narratives. The people, or some of the people, come against or raise a complaint, or they grumble against either God, Moses, Aaron, or a combination of the three. Then God is angry by this. It says that his anger was kindled. Literally, he becomes hot. God becomes hot in anger. And what happens is he breaks out in fire. Judgment begins, and then some sort of intercession has to take place. Usually Moses intercedes in some way for the people, and then there's a relenting. And this is all building towards chapter 14, when they rebel finally against the Exodus. They just say, we want no part of this. So there's our pattern. Then we start the second rebellion. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. That's the thing they're longing for. Remember when we used to eat garlic raw? It was delicious. But now our strength is dried up and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. So like they're not even talking about eating the manna. They're just like, all we have is just manna to look at. It's like when when you're a little kid, you go to the fridge and you open it and you're like, Mom, there's no food in the fridge. And she's like, there's an apple right there. I don't want an apple. It's like, there is food. They just don't want to eat it. So they're just staring at it and being all melancholy. Then you have a little description of what the manna is like. There's also a description in Exodus chapter 16. Now the manna was like coriander seed in its appearance, like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it and ground it into hand mills or beat it in mortars and boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. So this is just a little callback to Exodus 16. We should remember the story of Exodus 16. Exodus 16 is also where you get commands for the Sabbath. Before the people of Israel are in a covenant relationship with God, God gives them the Sabbath and says, on the seventh day, you rest from your work. But there's also another detail in Exodus 16 about what happens at nighttime. Does anyone remember what happens at nighttime? Bread in the morning. They don't have to give it up. Something else. Oh yeah, they can't keep it over, so they can't store it. They just have to wait till the next day to gather more. But there is another food provided at nighttime. Quail. You have a description in Exodus 16 that in the morning they wake up and there's manna, and at nighttime there's quail provided. So they've been provided meat. God has been providing meat for them. It comes at nighttime. There's just not a lot of detail or focus in the Exodus 16 narrative. The focus is on that bread that's being given. And then here you almost have to scratch your head and wonder, well, are they still being given meat, or has that stopped and they're just longing for the meat again? Regardless of whether or not they've been having meat or if they haven't, it's not so much the meat that they want. In their complaint, They are longing for Egypt. That is why this is a serious complaint. It's not that they're like, man, this diet is horrible. What they're longing for is Egypt. And that's going to culminate in 14 when they say, we're going to take a leader to take us back. So they're longing for Egypt rather than the promise of God of the promised land. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at their door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant, and why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give birth to them that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing child, to the land that you swore to give to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. If you will treat me like this, kill me at once. If I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. So Moses is kind of tapped out. He's like, leadership is pretty hard. These people are really stubborn. I don't want to do this anymore. God, you're not being fair to me. I thought this should be easy. So Moses' idea for how to fix this is give me some relief or kill me. Anyone else been there? Give me some relief or just kill me now. So then you have what follows is God condescending to Moses' request, where he allows this to take place, and the 70 elders come, and then the spirit that is placed on Moses is distributed amongst the 70 elders. So the burden is lifted from Moses and it's shared amongst Moses and the elders. And then you have this little wish at the very end, because remember, 2 of those 70 elders, they never came up to the mountain or up to the tent with Moses. They kind of stayed back in the camp, but then they started prophesying in 28. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses from his youth, said, my Lord, Moses, stop them. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Because they're prophesying and Moses is the prophet. Would that the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his spirit on all of them. And Moses and the elders of Israel returned to the camp. There's a small little wish of Moses of, it would be really great if the Spirit of God was on all of God's people. So that's a little seed that's going to get expanded in Deuteronomy. And then the prophets are just going to run with it about this promise of God where God's going to do a new thing. And instead of dwelling in the midst of his people, he's going to dwell in his people. That his Spirit is going to take up residence in his people and not leave them or forsake them. Did you have a question?
No, I was around.
Oh, yeah, it's great. And that we are the recipients of this promise. We are the ones who get to participate in this. Then the story picks up again. Then a wind from the Lord sprang up and brought quail from the sea and let them fall beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on the other side. So it's not like, I always picture this as being like dead quail being blown over and then they're just laying there. It's just like the wind is directing their flight patterns and the really small birds, and they get kind of tired, so then they land and like that's it. Like they're done for the night. They're just going to chill because of how small and tired they are. So they fly in, they're all over the ground. Verse 32, and the people rose all that day and all night and all the next day and gathered the quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. While the meat was yet between their teeth, before it was consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck down the people with a very great plague. Therefore, the name of that place was called Kirboth Hatava, because there they buried the people who had the craving. From Kibroth Hatava, the people journeyed to Hazeroth, and they remained at Hazeroth. So there's the conclusion of this little story. So the reason why judgment is coming on these people is not because they're breaking some sort of dietary laws. It's not because they're even eating meat per se. It's because the people in this rebellion, they want Egypt. They don't want the promised land. They don't want the provision of God. And that's why the judgment of God is coming upon them. The people who are dying in this narrative, they know that they don't want God and don't want the promised land. They are asking for something other than God's provision. So it's not everyone dying. It's not everyone eating the meat. But in this story, it's when they're biting into the animal that they die. And then there's going to be that story in 21 where an animal comes, and as it bites the people, they die. So there's these 2 stories of this biting Okay. Then you get the next story where Miriam and Aaron oppose Moses. And they kind of smokescreen their complaint. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoke only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. So this is like the only detail that we get about Moses marrying this Cushite woman. So a few thoughts. One, maybe they're calling Zipporah, his wife, maybe they're calling her a Cushite, but we know that she's a Midianite. So maybe they're just saying that she's Cushite, and Cush is in Egypt. So it'd be like modern day Ethiopia. So maybe they're just accusing Moses of marrying an Egyptian woman. That might be an accusation. We also haven't heard any mention of Zipporah since the book of Exodus. We have heard of Jethro in Numbers, so we know that that family is still around, but there's no mention of Zipporah. Maybe Moses did take another wife, and they're complaining against that. We don't have the details. We don't know. But what we can tell is that their complaint is not actually about Moses marrying this Cushite woman. Their complaint is about whether or not Moses is the leading prophet for the people. Their complaint is, has God really just spoken to you, or has he not spoken to all of us? Remember, 70 of our elders were just prophesying, and God was speaking to us through them. So then you have this great line. Now the man Moses was very meek or humble, more than all who were on the face of the earth. And people like this verse because Moses is writing the Torah, and they're like, Moses is talking about how humble he is. How humble are you if you talk about how humble you are? So, maybe a later scribe put this in because Moses was too humble to say it for himself. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and to Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them came out, and the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam. And they both came forward, and he said, hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. So their complaint is against Moses being the prophet of God, the mouthpiece of God, who God speaks face to face with. And God defends Moses and says Moses is faithful. And when we get to chapter 20, God is going to say that Moses is unfaithful. So we're going to see Moses' downfall in the book of Numbers. So God's judgment is Miriam becomes leprous. As the glory cloud lifts up, Miriam is leprous, and Aaron is terrified. He asks Moses to pray, to intercede on her behalf, so that she wouldn't be like one who is dead and then cut off from the people for 7 days. So leprosy is as if you are dead because you are removed from the community and therefore removed from participating in the tabernacle rituals. So it's a living death to have some sort of skin disease or malment, to where you're removed from the community and from the tabernacle. So the complaint is hey, you've essentially killed her. Can you please intercede? So then Moses intercedes. So those are the first three rebellion narratives. You have a general one that kind of sets the pattern. Then you have the people complaining about food. They're asking for food because they're longing for Egypt. Now the two, the brother and sister of Aaron are complaining against Moses. The brother and sister of Moses are complaining against Moses. So the leader of God's people. And now is going to be the pinnacle narrative where the people will complain against this whole Exodus agenda. They don't want to participate in it. So it starts with chapter 13, where 12 spies, one from each tribe, they go into the promised land, the land of Canaan, and they're there for 40 days, and they're spying out the land. And when they come back, they bring some like gigantic grapes on a giant pole just to show how good and luscious the land is. But they're also scared. They're like, hey, the Amalekites are in there. There's giants in there. The people are so numerous and so big. There's no way that we could beat them. Now, God has already promised them that he's going to give the land to the people. So when they say there is no way we can have the people, they are not measuring themselves against the people. They're saying there is no way God can do this. So they do not trust that God is able to do this. And this leads to the fourth rebellion narrative in chapter 14. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept all night because they just heard this report that it's going to be a really hard fight. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." So this is the pinnacle of their rebellion. They say, we don't want to be a part of this. We don't want to go into the promised land. We don't want to have to fight anybody. We don't trust that God's going to protect us. We would rather go back and be slaves and die there. So because of this is going to set the rest of the narrative. And this is the reason why for 40 years they're going to wander in the wilderness and not enter the promised land. So if we jump down to verse 32, let's start in verse 29. Let's start in verse 28. "Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness. And of all your number, listed in the census from 20 years old and upwards," so chapter 1, "who have grumbled against me, not one of them shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun." Because they were the ones who gave a good report of faith. They trust that God is able to do this. "But your little ones, who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lies in the wilderness. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day. You shall bear your iniquity 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this will I do to all this wicked generation, or wicked congregation, who are gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall come to a full end, and there they shall die." So the rest of the narratives, sometimes we can get lost in the rest of the narratives as being these isolated events. And if we do that, then some of them we can almost think, maybe God's being unreasonable in this situation. But every story that follows from here, it's heaping on top of this story. So God has already pronounced judgment that the people don't want the promised land. So he's going to give them what they want. They don't want the promised land. They won't get it. They'll die in the wilderness just like they want. But God is not ultimately going to punish their children. He's going to bring them into the promised land, although they will suffer because of the decisions of their parents. So the rest of the narrative, you're going to see this generation begin to fall through different actions and different judgments. And it goes all the way to the book of Deuteronomy, where the last chapter of Deuteronomy is about Moses dying. And after Moses dies, you get the book of Joshua, where they go into the promised land. So it really is until the last of this generation falls before the people enter the promised land. So this is just setting up the rest of the narratives, the rest of this book. And then Deuteronomy is going to be Moses speaking to this second generation. And then Joshua is going to be about Joshua leading the people into the promised land. Then the people they're like, well, wait a second, we don't actually want this to happen. Maybe we've made a bad decision. So then they're like, well, hey, we're going to make it up to you, God. Even though you're telling us not to go fight, we're just going to go fight anyways. We're going to win this battle for you. We're going to show you that we're actually on your side. And they go and they try and fight and they lose a battle because they're being disobedient to God. Like they're trying to atone for their sins through their works, and they fail to do it. So then you get a chapter about laws and sacrifices, about how do you actually atone for sin? Well, it's not by going out and doing works for God. It's about allowing there to be a sacrifice on your behalf. So that's what chapter 15 is about. We might, if we have time, come back and talk about the Sabbath breaker. Anyone ponder it? So good. We'll come back to it. I'm sure we'll have time. Okay. Then chapter 16, all the way leading into 17, this is now the first rebellion narrative after that promise of the 40 years and death. So this is just heaping on judgment to what was already been given. And it's Korah, who is a Levite, and he gets this group of 250 chiefs, and they're assembling themselves against Moses and Aaron to raise this complaint. And if you look at verse 11, this is Moses speaking. He says, or actually start in verse 10, and that he has brought you near him and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you. And would you seek the priesthood also? So he's saying, Corey, you're not satisfied with the position God has already given you, that now you're actually seeking the priesthood rather than just the service of the tabernacle. Therefore, it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is Aaron that you grumble against him? So Moses is just seeing through their complaints. Even though they're coming, they're complaining to both leaders, the prophet and the priest of God's people. What they're complaining about is who should be the high priest. And Korah is basically saying, well, maybe I should be the high priest. I mean, I'm a Levite. I could probably do this job just as well as anyone else. How come you guys get to be the holy ones and get to be set apart? And Moses' first response is, you've already been given so much, and yet you want more. It's not enough that you get to serve the tabernacle when no one else in Israel gets to do that, but you actually want to become the high priest. So when will enough be enough? So they set up this way for God to judge them. They're all going to come out with censers of incense and smoke, and God's just going to judge the people. And it's, if you guys die a natural death, like a few years go by and you get a little old and you just kind of keel over, then, we are wrong. But if God does something miraculous in this moment, then let God's judgment be heard. So God opens the earth and swallows them. It's crazy. We're not going to read it all, but it's just a crazy narrative where God swallows Korah and the 250 chiefs and all those who had assembled with them. So remember the census. It's like thousands and thousands of people are in this wilderness. There's probably a good tribe of people who are like, yeah, we want Korah to be our leader. And God swallows them up because they are rebelling against his anointed one. Remember the Messiah means anointed one, and the high priest is the first anointed one in the Bible. So they're rebelling against the Messiah of Israel. And what God does is he swallows up those who rebel against his Messiah. That's what this narrative is depicting and showing us. But after that rebellion, in verse 41, there's like a little bonus rebellion. But on the next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. So they just got swallowed by the earth. They got swallowed by the earth, and now they're like, hey, Moses, you're killing our people. Well, who killed the people, right? And when the congregation had assembled against Moses and Aaron, they turned towards the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. And Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, get away from the midst of this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell on their faces, and Moses said to Aaron, take your censer and put fire on it from off the altar and lay incense on it, and carry it quickly to the congregation and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord, the plague has begun. So Aaron took it as Moses said and ran into the midst of the assembly. And behold, the plague had already begun among the people. But he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. So think about this picture. The word atonement, it just means to cover. That's its basic meaning. Then there's all these theological meanings of this word. If you know the holiday Yom Kippur, it pops up on your Apple calendar. That's the Day of Atonement. Kippur or kafar is the Hebrew word to cover. So he's making atonement by bringing this censer, which is like this bowl of like burning ashes and incense that makes a little smoke cloud. So as the smoke rises up, it's as if it makes a cloud covering over the people. So this is a depiction of the theological atonement taking place with a visible picture. So the cloud covers them and begins to save some. And he stood between the dead and the living, and the plague was stopped. Now those who died in the plague were 14,700 people, besides those who died in the affair of Korah. And Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance of the tent of meeting when the plague was stopped. So that's an intense one. A lot of people die. Not everyone is dying, though. So if you remember, it's the list in the census in chapter 1 is over 600,000 people. When we get to chapter 26, it's a completely new generation. No one is listed in both of them. So everyone listed in Numbers 26 is completely different people than there are listed in Numbers chapter 1. And it's over 600,000. So God replaces all these people with the next generation. But from Numbers 14 onward, you have to have 600,000 people die. So 14,000 actually isn't that much of that number. Yeah. Do you have a question?
Oh, yes. So in chapter 14, there's the mention of this.
Mm-hmm.
The Levites were
there is a listing of the Levites. It's just not in the census for people who can fight.
Okay, so
yeah.
Were the Levites still banned from promise?
That's a really good question. That's a good question. I assume that they are, but I could be wrong because, I mean, Aaron and Miriam and Moses are all Levites, and they are part of the ones who perish, and the Korahites also. So I think they are counted in that. So I don't think it's just the census of those who go to war, but the entire generation. So the Levite listings is actually more intense because it lists everyone from birth. It might be according to service. So a Levite can serve in the tabernacle or as a priest from the age of 25 to 50. So it might be counting those people. Yeah. Then you have the story of Aaron's staff budding. It just seems like a weird and obscure story, but this is an affirmation of Aaron's leadership. Just like you have the affirmation of Moses' leadership in chapter 12, where God says, Moses is faithful in my household. Here you have Aaron's staff budding, which is an affirmation of Aaron's leadership. So you have these miraculous affirmations of leadership for these appointed leaders taking place. Now let's go to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is framed by death. You have the death of Miriam at the beginning and the death of Aaron at the end. So death of Miriam, then death of Aaron at the beginning, and right in the middle is Moses' rebellion of unfaithfulness. This is the reason why Moses does not enter the promised land. This is when Moses disqualifies himself from being Israel's leader that brings them into the promised land. So just before we do like a walkthrough of it, just to ponder the tragedy that Moses is experiencing in this literary pattern, his sister just died. And then the people are coming and they're like, give us water. You're not feeding us. You're not taking care of us. Imagine the emotional turmoil that Moses would be feeling in that moment. So we can have compassion for how he lashes out against God and against the people. He's torn up because of the close death he's just experienced. Miriam is the one who basically raises him. She not only helps his mom save him, but then is like his raising nurse in Pharaoh's household when Pharaoh's daughter takes him in. So this is like a sister, a mother figure, and now she's just died, and then he lashes out. We can have compassion on that. And yet, just because of his circumstances, that doesn't excuse his actions. So at the same time, we should be aware that just because we're going through turmoil, when we lash out, that doesn't excuse our behavior. We can have compassion on that behavior, but it doesn't excuse it, because this still disqualifies Moses from the promised land. So there's the death of Miriam. This passage ends with the death of Aaron. And it's a similar narrative to how Moses dies. They're up on a mountain. God takes him away. But right in the middle, you have this story of the waters of Miraba, or the waters of bitterness, similar to the story that we had in Exodus, with a few key differences. Now, there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, and the word quarreled is like making a lawsuit against someone, or maybe even fighting with someone. This isn't like a kind conversation. They are clashing heads. And they said, would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded. Do you guys remember what God tells him to do in Exodus? Strike the rock. He says, take the staff and strike the rock. I will stand before it. So in a sense, Moses strikes God and God outpours water. And that's in the book of Exodus. So the first time this narrative happens, they go to a rock. God tells him, take the staff and strike the rock. But here he says, take your staff and go speak to the rock. Very different actions, both verbs, but one you strike, the other you speak. So go speak to the rock and it will give water. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and he struck the rock with his staff twice. And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, because you did not have faith to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Miraba, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. So why would Moses strike the rock? Frustration. And also that's what he did the first time. So he's like, well, I know this works. So he's seen God work in a certain way, and then he wants to repeat that action of God. He wants to repeat the miracle of God through using the same devices. He wants to reproduce the mountaintop experience for the people. But some mountaintop experiences aren't actually reproducible. They're one-time moments. But here he strikes out of frustration, and also because he's seen it. But whose credit is being given here? Is it Moses or is it God? Well, it's Moses. He's like, shall we bring water out of this rock for you? Shall me and Aaron, shall we provide to you, you rebels? So he defames the people of God. He calls them a name. God has never called them that in this story. He just says to give water to his people. So Moses calls them rebels. Then he takes credit for the miracle. He disobeys God's word, and he does not trust God's way of providing for his people. And we have the interpretation from God himself that through this, he's not considering God as holy. He's not exalting God as being unique and holy before the people. So what God does is he shows himself to be holy through this judgment. At the very end, through them, he showed himself holy. I think that's not just talking about the water coming out of the rock, but because God doesn't allow Moses and Aaron to go into the promised land, God is showing himself to be holy, to be perfect, to be just, to be glorious, to be righteous, to be a God of judgment, yet also a God of grace and provision. So God shows himself to be holy despite Moses not showing God to be holy. Because of this, Aaron and Moses are both disqualified from the land. Okay, now we get to the seventh rebellion narrative. Oh, before we go there, remember in 1 Corinthians 10, when it says the spiritual rock that followed them, the rock that followed them, because they've come to this rock twice. It's as if this pesky rock in the wilderness is following them around to provide water for them. So Paul, that's funny that he says the rock that followed them there. Okay.
Wait, real quick.
Yeah.
Why is Aaron also like
Because it is both of them who are told to do this. So in
But it still seems like this is it didn't seem like Moses planned this to strike the rock. So like what was shock? So already in motion.
Well, Moses and Aaron are already technically disqualified, being a part of the generation. In verse 6, you have, then Moses and Aaron went to the presence of the assembly. So Moses and Aaron intercede together before God. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron, your brother. So it's both of them who are supposed to go and tell the rock. They're both supposed to provide. And then in verse 10, then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. So they're both gathering them together. Like this wasn't just like God tells them, they're like, okay, everybody come on out. Boom. Like there's some forethought to what's going on. This took some time for them to get there, but it's Moses and Aaron going out and then they're speaking to them. So yeah, Moses is the one who strikes, but Aaron is the high priest. He is the one who represents all the people of God. And remember back in Leviticus chapter 16, it is the high priest who bears the iniquity of the people. Yes. You had a question and then we'll go there.
We'll just Aaron. This it says like Moses and some other said to them. So could it be that Aaron is the one who calls them fools or the baptized?
It could be, but it seems like it's Moses speaking. Yeah, I mean the verb is just he said. So your translation is trying to like help you know who is saying, probably because of that question. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that we were going through the rebellion generation there, that there was that earlier story about Aaron and Miriam coming up during questioning authority.
Yep.
And I took that to their disqualified sin. Aaron's disqualified. Why he didn't.
Well, here you get a specific mention that this is why Aaron doesn't go in. In verse 12, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me. So both of them lacked faith. To uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. So it might be connected to that past event, but you get the explicit mention here. And this is kind of the way these narratives work, where one of them might be lacking some detail and one of them might have the detail. So when you read them together, like we're doing right now, where we're skipping through and just reading those rebellion narratives, they start to mesh together. And it's like we get information later in a story about a previous story. And that is actually how Numbers tends to function. We don't have time for it at all, or I don't have the mental capacity to do it. But when you read chapters 1 through 5, you get all this detail about how the Levites are positioning around the tabernacle and all this stuff. But it's not until you get to chapter 18 and 19, I think, that you get the explanation for why they do that. So you actually get information at the beginning that doesn't apply until halfway through the book. So this is how meditation literature works. So this is great what we're doing here, where you're saying, well, there was that story before where they rebelled and now they're dying. So yeah, maybe that was the disqualifying thing for Aaron and Miriam. But this one mentions that he's definitely not going to go into the promised land after this. Yeah.
So
Yep. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And what happens to Adam and Eve after they're disqualified? They're removed from the land. Now they are unable to go into the land. So yeah, if you really want to get nerdy sometimes, just like read Genesis 3 over and over again and then read these stories and tons of things will pop out. Like read them with a few colored pencils and highlight things that are similar and it'll start to blow your mind. Especially Adam's role in the Genesis 2 and 3 narrative and how he relates to his wife and how he's supposed to and where he is throughout the story. And then how Aaron interacts with people like Moses and other people. Everything is very interesting. So good job. John.
Sorry to add another question.
No, you're good.
As we're like talking through this and how Moses is like almost, so he's saying, shall we bring water?
Mm-hmm.
Take credit. So how does this compare to when he's talking to Pharaoh, saying, let my people go, and the actions that are going on? So is he back in Exodus just God will do this, or is he doing it?
Throughout all the plagues in Exodus, he starts his speeches as, thus says the Lord. So he is saying the words of God, even though he then starts speaking, he says, I will liberate my people with my outstretched arm. I will do these things, but it's the words of God coming through him. Here, Moses' words. Yeah, so that's how you see the difference. Okay, we have one more rebellion story that we're going to look at, and then we're going to do the Balaam oracles. From Mount Hor, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And the people became impatient on the way, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we hate this worthless food. It's like, there's no food for us to eat, and we hate what's in the fridge. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many people of Israel died. Fiery serpents, these are like poisonous snakes. When a poisonous snake bites you, it burns a little bit. So that's why they're called fiery snakes. It's the word seraph, which later in Isaiah chapter 6, there will be seraphim flying around God. There'll be like these like fiery snakes with 6 wings, 2 covering their head, 2 covering their body, and then 2 flying. But the idea is that there's these poisonous snakes. They're coming in. They're biting the people. This is God's judgment on them for complaining or speaking against God and Moses, and also complaining about the food. God is still providing food every day for these people. And the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. So Moses intercedes. And the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten when he sees it shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. So there's a vicarious application of by looking upon the object of death and the punishment of death for their sins, by looking at the judgment on their sins, they're actually saved from it. And it's applied through this connection. And this pattern of connection has been started in Leviticus when they would place a hand on the animal. And then on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would place 2 hands. So it's as if the looking is the placing of the hands. This is how you connect your moment of faith where you let that vicariously be applied to you. This is a really important section in Numbers, especially for understanding Jesus. Nicodemus said to him, how can these things be? Jesus answered him, are you the teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? Truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and bear witness to what we have seen, but you do not receive our testimony. If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. So Jesus sees the story in Numbers about the bronze serpent being lifted up to be about him. That is a story about Jesus. And the bronze serpent story is about the object of judgment being lifted up for eyes to look upon. And when you look upon it with your eyes, it actually becomes the object of salvation. And Jesus, he being lifted up on the cross, is the judgment for sin. The wages of sin is death. And as the Son of Man is lifted up in judgment, he also becomes the object of salvation. But it's not applied through sight, it's applied through belief. Your faith is how Jesus' righteousness and his substitutionary death is vicariously applied to you. The fancy word is imputation for what's going on there. So that story in Numbers is about Jesus. Remember, these things were written down as an example for us. And just as Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, remember he says, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. The rock was Christ. He's saying in Numbers and in Exodus, the rock is not a rock, it's Christ being struck to provide life for the rebellious people. So Numbers is about the Christ, who is Jesus. So as we read these narratives, they should push us towards Christ, not push us towards like an application like, well, Moses lacked faith and that's why he didn't enter the promised land. Therefore, if we just muster up more faith in this present moment, then we will live. No, you don't have faith and you rebel all the time and you complain and you grumble against God and against his people. What you need is a rock. And what you need is someone to be lifted up on your behalf to where when you look at him, when you behold, when you see, when you believe, when you trust that Christ has died for you, that is when you are saved from the bite that you have suffered, the bite of sin, which is causing death. Yeah, Mike.
What was that reference?
We were in John 3.
John 3.
Yep, the conversation with Nicodemus, and that was verse 15, right before verse 16. For God so loves the world that he gave his only son so that whoever believes in him should not perish from the bite of sin, but have eternal life. Okay, so those are the arguably the 7 rebellion stories. Maybe there's one more, but I want to look at the Balaam oracles because they're awesome. It's the only reason why. Okay, in one of the emails, I gave you bonus reading. I don't know if you did it or if you saw it. Sometimes I talk to people, I'm like, do you read my emails? And they're like, what emails? So it's okay if you don't read those emails, but you should all be getting them. If you don't at least get them, let me know. But twice in the New Testament, Balaam is referenced in the book of Jude and then in 2 Peter chapter 2. And Balaam is talked about as a false teacher who takes the bribes of people to then give the oracles of God. So just for reflection, Balaam only speaks what God tells him to speak in these narratives. But the way he's enticed into this is the king of not the king of Midian. What Balak is the king of Moab. King of Moab. And then the Midianite elders, they come together and they get this bribe price together for divination. And then they go to Balaam. So they're like, hey, will you curse the people of Israel for us? And here's our money. And he's like, well, I can only say what the Lord tells me to do. So out of his greed, he enters into this position of being a prophet or being a teacher. He takes the money and then he speaks all these true things. But the New Testament condemns him, both in Jude and in 2 Peter 2, as being one who is only doing this for greed. And they label him as a false and deceptive teacher who's doing it to fill his own pockets. So he is fleecing the sheep, as it were. Okay, so you have the stuff about the donkey, which is awesome. It's like so weird. Guys, God can speak through a donkey. He can speak through you too. Just share the gospel with people. God can do a lot with a little. I remind myself that every Tuesday when I'm like, I don't know if this is a good sermon. I'm like, well, God spoke through a donkey and Jesus turns water into wine. He can do something through me too. So these are patterns of 3 where the donkey 3 times averts in the path because the angel of the Lord is standing before it, and the donkey sees, but Balaam does not see the angel of the Lord. So 3 times the donkey averts, and 3 times Balaam strikes his donkey. So then God opens the mouth of the donkey, and then Balaam gets asked 3 questions. He gets 2 questions from the donkey and then a question from the angel of the Lord. And the question is like, why are you hitting me? That's the first one. And the second one is, have I ever misled you in my life? why would you like mistrust me now? And then the angel of the Lord asks him a question. And then there's a bonus speaking to Balaam where the angel of the Lord just speaks to him and says, you're going to go, but you're only going to say the words that I put in your mouth. So that corresponds these 3 times Balaam is spoken to. Now Balaam is going to speak 3 times plus 1. So there's going to be 4 oracles of Balaam. And the entire narrative, this is all taking place like up on a mountain away from the people of Israel, because the king of Moab and the people of Midian have seen that these people are numerous. And they're like, we don't want to go to war. We don't want to lose with them. So we're going to get someone to curse them. And remember back in Genesis chapter 12, promise to Abraham, I'm going to bless those who bless you. And I'm going to curse those who curse you. So if that doesn't tell you where the rest of the story will go for the Midianites and the Moabites. So they're up on a mountain. This is all taking place, and the Israelites don't know this is happening. So this is like you got brought into the divine curtain, and you are seeing the behind the scenes play out of God protecting this rebellious people. These people are still rebellion, and yet without their knowing, God is protecting them and he's blessing them. So we're just going to read the oracles. From Aram, Balak has brought me, the king of Moab from the eastern mountains. Come, curse Jacob for me, and come, denounce Israel. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? For from the top of the crags I see him, from the hills I behold him. Behold, the people dwell alone, and not counting itself among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the upright, and let my end be like this. So remember the promises to Abraham that he'll be really numerous, that he'll be as numerous as the stars, not able to be numbered, and that he'll be like the dust of the earth, the sands of the seashore. So there's the language of the Abrahamic blessing in the blessing of Balaam over the people. In verse 10, when it says, who can count the dust of Jacob or number the 4th part of Israel? It's like a little Hebraism, like a Hebrew figure of speech to say 3, even 4 of something. It's just say a lot. Just like in the New Testament when Peter asked Jesus, how many times am I going to have to forgive my brother? 7 times? And Jesus is like, 70 times 7 times. Like the point's not 70 times 7 times, the mathematical equation, but that you're going to have to do this over and over again. Same thing with saying 3 even to the 4th. So that because he's saying the 4th, he's saying they're unnumberable. There's too many to be counted. Then the second oracle, Balaam took up his discourse. I'm in chapter 23. Rise, Balak, and hear, give ear to me, O son of Zippor. God is not a man that he should lie. Pause. Okay. People who use the Bible wrong will quote this verse and say, see, the hypostatic union is heresy because God is not a man. People quote this verse right here to go against God becoming incarnate in Jesus Christ. They're simply just not reading their Bible. They're using a proof text. Guess what? The devil also quotes scripture, and he does really bad exegesis. So there's a difference between using the Bible faithfully and unfaithfully. And if we just read this in context, the point is not about the incarnation. The point is about whether or not God says what is true or what is false. God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot revoke it. He has not beheld misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord their God is with them, and the shout of a king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt, and is for them like the horns of the wild ox. For there is no enchantment against Jacob, no divination against Israel. Remember, Jacob gets renamed Israel, so they're using these names interchangeably. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what has God wrought? Behold, a people, as a lioness, it rises up, and as a lion, it lifts itself. It does not lie down until it has devoured the prey and drunk the blood of the slain. That's a good one. In verse 21, the Lord their God is with them, and the shout of a king is among them. The shout of a king is among them. Remember the promise to Abraham back in chapter 17? Let's see if we can find it real quick. Genesis 17. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. Verse 6. Kings shall come from you. And this is what Adam was made to be. Adam and Eve were made to be kings and queens of creation. So God, from the beginning, has determined to reign over his creation, to rule over his creation through a human king. Sin puts that off course, but God is faithful to that plan. So even back to Abraham, he says, kings are going to come from you. And then we get to this guy named Judah in chapter 49 of Genesis. And we hear that the scepter will never depart from Judah's line. And that in Judah's line, Genesis 49, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter, which is what a king holds. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him and the obedience of the people. And it goes on. So here in Numbers 23, they hear the shout of a king. And he says, behold, a people as a lioness, it rises up. And as a lion, it is lifted up. It does not lie down until it has devoured the prey and drunk the blood of the slain, just like the teeth. We didn't read it all, but the blessing to Judah, the teeth will be stained. So Balaam is using the promises of to Abraham, the promises to Jacob, to then bless the people. This is all language from the blessing to Judah and the blessing to Abraham. Then the third oracle. The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, and the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down with his eyes uncovered. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens besides a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his bucket, and his seed shall be in many waters. So think about the description that he's giving of Israel. He describes them as tents, tabernacles, and then he describes them as a garden. He's thinking about the people of God as being a tabernacle or as a garden that God has planted. So this is Eden imagery, and then this is tabernacle imagery. And he's looking at the people of God and saying, the people of God are this tabernacle and garden. Guys, the New Testament, that's what we are, is we are the tabernacle of God that have been planted in the love of Christ. That's Ephesians chapter 3. Then he says in verse 3, water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. We didn't look at this in depth, but all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, there's a promise. And the promise is that from the woman would come an offspring who will crush the head of the serpent. We should actually read it real quick. Genesis 3:15. Talked about briefly, remember I said it's the proto-evangelion. You're like, what does that mean? First gospel promise. So Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He, that is the offspring of the woman, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So there's going to be this mutual striking where the offspring of the woman will crush the source of evil, which is the snake. And through this striking of the head, this crushing of the head, the offspring will also receive a blow. You don't need to be some crazy Hebrew scholar or anything, but just know that the word offspring is the Hebrew word for seed. Seed. So, and between your seed and her seed, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel, the seed. In Numbers 24 here, verse 7, his seed or his offspring shall be in many waters. Remember the last time we had a deliverer in the waters? Moses in the basket? The offspring of deliverance for the people of Israel was in the waters. Well, his seed will be in many waters. And waters, as we keep reading, and as you've been reading through the Psalms, waters is also a metaphor for the nations. So in the midst of the nations, a seed is going to rise up. His king, so now it's being connected. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So this seed in the many waters is going to be a king that is exalted above all the nations. God brings him out of Egypt and is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, and shall break their bones in pieces and pierce them through with his arrow. He crouched, he lay down like a lion, and like a lioness, who will rouse him up? So again, that language from Genesis 49 about the Lion of Judah. Blessed are those who bless you, and cursed are those who curse you. So again, the blessing that he's giving on Israel is that from them is going to come a seed who's going to become a king over all the nations, and he's going to reign victorious over all of them. Then we get a bonus one. I will let you know, starting in verse 14, I will let you know what this people will do to your people in the latter days. This phrase has showed up also in Genesis 49, in the latter days, in the end days is what it is in Hebrew. In the end days, this is what this people will do. He took up his discourse and he said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down with his eyes uncovered. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. It's talking about this future person. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. Genesis 49. And star language, Genesis 37, about the dreams of Joseph, where where the stars are bowing down to him. So this is kingly language. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Where is the forehead located? On the head. Crush the head of the serpent? You guys seen this? Edom shall be disposed. Seir also, his enemies, shall be disposed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities. Then he looked at Amalek and took up his discourse and said, Amalek was the first among the nations, but its end is utter destruction. And he looked on the Kenite and took up his discourse and said, enduring is your dwelling place, and your nest is set in the rock. Nevertheless, Cain shall be burned with Asher, or Assyria, takes you away in captive. And he took up his discourse and said, alas, who shall live when God does this? But ships shall come from Kittim and shall afflict Asher and Ever, and he too shall come to utter destruction. So his prophecy, his oracle about the last days, the end time, is that no nation is going to stand except for the one who is exalted out of Israel, who is the king, who will reign, who will crush the head of the enemy. So this is building on to Genesis 3:15, that a seed of the woman is going to come and he's going to be raised up out of the waters as a deliverer among the nations, and is going to bring a kingdom above all kingdoms that reigns in peace and victory, and no other kingdom will stand. This is all going to get picked up by the prophets later, and then it's going to resolve in Jesus, who is the seed of the woman, who is simultaneously is struck by the weapon of the enemy, death, while getting the death blow on the enemy, Satan. And as he is lifted up above the nations, he brings salvation and a kingdom to all who come to him, and no other nation stands. To where we can say, along with Paul in Philippians 2 verse 10, it says, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So this is where everything is resolving, that Christ is King. We have 7 minutes for questions, a little less than I thought. But questions on this or anything else in Numbers, you guys get to take it from here. Yes.
So this is kind of related to that. It seems like in Matthew, Jesus isn't actually from the line of that Joseph is. Joseph marries Mary, but it doesn't say that Mary is from the line of Judah, and we don't know, Mary's.
We do in Luke. Luke, there's a genealogy of Mary, and Mary is also from the line of Judah. So if you want to think biologically, then yes, Jesus is from the line of Judah through Mary, but they don't operate their genealogies biologically. It's the household that you are in, and Jesus is in the household of Joseph. He is from the tribe of Judah because he is Joseph's son. Yeah. So either way you want to look at it, he is from the line of Judah, and that's one of the things that gets brought up in book of Hebrews, is because the author of Hebrews is saying Jesus is our high priest, but the objection is, well, I thought the high priest is supposed to be from the tribe of Levi. And he starts talking about how Jesus is a better high priest from the order of Melchizedek because he is from the line of Judah. He is not from the line of Aaron. So it was well known in the first century that Jesus of Nazareth was from the tribe of Judah. Yes?
One of the things I noticed of the chapter there on
Mm-hmm.
and how the myriad of ways they cleanse themselves and
Mm-hmm.
to burn sacrifice priests. I was thinking to myself that after the temple was destroyed, modern day Jews,
Mm-hmm.
how do they
There is a quote from a rabbi within the time of the destruction that says, "Now we make atonement through prayer and good works." Yeah. So in the rabbinical tradition, the rabbis can also, modify how things are operating depending on their current circumstances. Yeah. And then it would depend on tradition of Judaism. So there's 5 sects of Judaism, really thinking in broad categories, all the way from ultra-Orthodox to liberal Judaism. And depending on where someone is on that spectrum would kind of determine how they interact with laws like that now. Any other questions on Numbers? Yeah.
What did you want to tell us about the wood gatherer on the Sabbath?
Oh, okay. Numbers 15. So, this is right after they reject the Exodus, and then they try to atone for their own sins by doing something for God, and that is not how this works, and they lose the battle. So then you get these laws about how to make sacrifices and how to make these offerings, and then you get laws about unintentional sin, and this is kind of like a repeat from when we were in Leviticus chapter 5 or chapter 6, I think, laws on unintentional sin. And then as we're going through, starting in verse 27, if one person sins unintentionally, he shall offer a female goat a year old for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement before the Lord for the person who makes a mistake when he sins unintentionally, to make atonement for him, and he shall be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the people of Israel, and for the stranger who sojourns among them. But the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he's a native or a sojourner, reviles the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among the people, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be upon him. While the people of Israel were in the wilderness. So sometimes these are unhelpful because it breaks it up for us in our mind. You just got told about the difference between someone who sins unintentionally and someone who sins with a high hand, which is basically giving the finger to God of, I want to do this sin, and I don't care what people say, and I don't care about this God, and I don't want to worship him. That is sinning with a high hand. It is intentional sinning with no remorse. And in fact, in Leviticus, I think it's chapter 6, you also have laws for when someone sins intentionally, but then comes to remorse and regret and wants to repent. There's laws for how they can do it too. So when we get to verse 32, while the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron, to all the congregation. They put him in custody because they didn't know what to do with him. And the Lord said to Moses, the man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as the Lord commanded Moses. So if you just read those verses, you're like, whoa, that's pretty extreme, God. Like, I preached this in high school, and my title for the sermon was "A Guy Gets Stoned on the Weekend." And I told the high schoolers that, and none of them laughed. So I guess we have pretty good high schoolers, but you guys did, so sinners. So a guy gets stoned on the weekend. You're like, well, he's just picking up sticks, and God's going to put him to death for this. But in the context, you just found out about high-handed sin. The people don't know what to do with this person. They're like, well, what should be done? And God sentences him to death to be cut off from the people, which is the consequence of the high-handed sin. The person shall be cut off from among his people. So the first thing we can infer is that this person is sinning with a high-handed sin. He wants to sin, and he has no remorse and no intention of repenting of this. He is rejecting God. Not only is he sinning against God, but he's breaking the Sabbath, which is a sin against the created order, because God created the Sabbath all the way back on page 1 of your Bible. It's not a thing just for Israel. It's a thing for all people. The Sabbath was made for man. So he's sinning against the created order. He's also sinning against the covenant. This is the covenant sign for the Mosaic covenant. The Sabbath is the sign that they're in a covenant. Just like circumcision is the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, Sabbath is the sign of the Mosaic covenant. And a ring is the sign of a marriage covenant. So if I were like, this is so stupid, and I took this ring off and I chucked against the wall, I want nothing to do with this. I'm not saying I want nothing to do with the ring. I'm saying I want nothing to do with the covenant. So to throw away the covenant sign is to throw away your commitment to the covenant. And not only is he rejecting the covenant sign, but he's rejecting the creator. So it's not just about the sign, it's about the creator also. So this is a huge sin that this person is committing. It's intentional. There's no desire to turn away from it. It's rejecting created order. It's rejecting the covenant, and it's rejecting the covenant God. Yeah, you had a question.
Okay, so God can like one. So why would he off like why would he have his people rather than just
There's a difference between murder and execution. Murder is an unjust killing. Execution is a just killing. Just like all the way back in Genesis chapter 9, the consequence of taking someone's life is that your life will be owed. That is in the case of an unjust killing, but then who's going to exact the just killing? So there is a difference between killing and murder. Murder is unjust, killing is just. So in this circumstance, God is bringing his justice through the assembled congregation. They participate in it. And imagine what that would do to you if you have to participate in the judgment of others. Perhaps you will not be so inclined to also rebel against God. Does that make sense? Okay. We are out of time. Let me pray for us, and then I'll see you guys next week. Father, thank you for your graciousness, and that in the rebellion of your people, God, you did not abandon everyone, although you could have. You could have stepped away from your people, but God, you were faithful to your promises, and you preserved a remnant of Israel, and you brought them into the promised land. And God, from that nation, you raised up a king, and from that king, God, you raised up another king. From King David, God, you brought us King Jesus, and Jesus, as he is lifted up on the cross, he provides life as we believe in him, as we look upon him. So God, I ask that for all of us this morning that we would look upon Jesus, that we believe on his life, death, and resurrection, and find in his faithfulness, we would find rest for our weary souls that you offer us. So God, continue to be good to us, continue to mold us into the image of your Son, and continue to remove the complaints from our hearts. God, we love you and we need you to pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.